Welcome to the greatest movie of all time. Tonight we bring you number 39, Jaws. I'm Tom Duncan.
And I'm Dana Duncan.
But before we get to the show, a few housekeeping notes. One, if you haven't been listening to the Dynasty Download, you're missing out. We're covering everything you need to know for your weekly fantasy football lineups, especially if you play Dynasty League football like we do. There are 2 episodes every week, so there's more than enough content to get you and your lineup ready each week. Check us out wherever you get your podcasts. With that, Dad, are you ready to discuss Jaws?
Yes, I am.
Dun-dun. That's all you need to really know. I'm sure it's going to come up, but literally you only have to do that, and everybody immediately knows exactly what it is. That will definitely come up in my review, let's say. So, quickly, let's move over to plot summary. When a young woman is killed by a shark while skinny dipping near the New England tourist town of Amity Island, Police Chief Martin Brody, played by Roy Scheider, wants to close the beaches, but Mayor Larry Vaughn, played by Murray Hamilton, overrules him, fearing that the loss of tourist revenue will cripple the town. I'm going to have a terrible time with this word, but Ichthyologist Matt Hooper, played by Richard Dreyfuss, and grizzled ship captain Quint, played by Robert Shaw, offer to help Brody capture the killer beast, and the trio engage in an epic battle of man versus nature. This film was nominated for Best Picture, won for Best Film Editing, Original Score, and Best Sound. It was number 48 on the American Film Institute's 100 Years, 100 Movies list from 1998. It dropped to number 56 on the 10-year anniversary list in 2007. AFI also ranked The Shark at number 18 on its list of 50 best villains. Roy Scheider's line, "You're going to need a bigger boat," is number 35 on a list of the top 100 movie quotes. Williams' score at 6th on a list of 100 years of film scores, and the film is 2nd on a list of 100 most thrilling films behind only Psycho. In 2001, it was selected by the Library of Congress for preservation in the United States National Film Registry as, quote, culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant, end quote. In 2003, the New York Times included the film on its list of best 1,000 movies ever made. The following year, Jaws placed at the top of Bravo's network's 5-hour miniseries, The Scariest 100 Movie Moments. The Chicago Film Critics Association named it the 6th scariest film ever made in 2006. In 2008, Jaws was ranked the 5th greatest film in history by Empire magazine, which also placed Quint at number 50 on its list of 100 greatest movie characters of all time. The film has been cited in many other lists of 50 and 100 greatest films, including ones compiled by Leonard Maltin, Entertainment Weekly, Film 4, Rolling Stone, Total Film, TV Guide, and Vanity Fair. So what is your relationship to this movie, Dad?
Well, first of all, the movie itself came out when I was rather young. I would have been a 4th or 5th grader. So, I would have been seeing it later on, like when it was on, I believe, HBO. But the interesting thing is the best-selling book by Peter Benchley, my babysitter for that summer of 74, was reading it. And so I asked her what it was and what it was about. So she started reading it. So she read the book to me when I was 9, 10 years old. And so I knew the story beforehand.
Which is interesting given how much of the book is basically scrapped for the movie. I think in my research I saw that Spielberg once said that there's about 27 scenes by his count that were not a part of the book that are part of the movie. And there are huge subplots that are completely scrapped in order to make this much more entertaining. Basically, Spielberg wanted to use the last third of the movie where they're out at sea as closer to the book, but that he wanted to almost completely rewrite the first half of the movie. So
Peter Benchley wrote the screenplay, or at least in part, and so there were liberties taken, but it was with his consent.
I certainly don't have a personal affiliation with this movie in any way. This was a movie that I watched maybe a few years ago. This is only the second time I've seen it, and I think that's been the case with a lot of the movies we've done so far, that it's usually my second or third viewing. But it was on a list of important movies that I needed to get through, and it was a project I'd been personally working on for quite a while. So this was clearly one of those, and I mean, you could tell it by its recognition list, how important just about everybody universally thinks that it is. We'll kind of go through that when we get to the categories and the rankings and such, but it's quite clear and evident that, or where everybody places this movie and its importance in film history. So what is this movie about?
It is about overcoming odds. It is about economics versus, I mean, take out the word shark and just put COVID-19 in, and you've got the same movie.
I don't think that's necessarily an original take. I've seen the memes being passed around a lot, and that's why when I was watching the film over the weekend, I was texting you about that there are so many similarities. But I think if I were to glean one particular thing out of this movie, it's an adventure movie first. And I think the notion that it's a very simple concept, high-energy adventure movie, particularly given what we got afterward from Spielberg and several others, because I would say that he makes several of these very simple concept adventure-type movies. Close Encounters to a certain extent is, but it's a little bit more sci-fi. Raiders of the Lost Ark, E.T., Jurassic Park are all kind of in that narrative where you don't need a lot of backstory or a lot of background to understand kind of what's going on, and it's going to be somewhat of an epic adventure type of situation. But if there were to be a universal trope that I take out of it, it's primarily the first half of the movie, like you did yourself. But it's a movie that teaches the importance of not taking certain situations seriously enough. And I think that we have such a cavalier attitude sometimes that we don't want to be petrified. I know you've used the term, although you use it more in a different manner, but paralysis by analysis. And normally I think that's what people are more afraid of, that they're not going to be able to act quickly enough in certain situations. But I also think that there's a balance between the two, that sometimes this cavalier attitude that we have because we don't want to be frozen in a situation by taking things too cautiously doesn't give us enough caution in the times that we actually need it. And so we really haven't found a good balance between the two attitudes sometimes, where we need to be cautious and take things with a certain level of trepidation, but we also need to be assertive in making very astute actions when need to be.
There are 4 parts of this ultimately. Number 1, Quint, because of his experience on the Indianapolis, this was a very personal experience to him. That's why he destroyed the radio. He was going to be the one that was going to kill this shark. And ultimately, his revenge mentality was his own demise. Brody is all about redemption from being accused of by the boy's mother of being responsible for his death. He's going to avenge this. Hooper is just interested in the fish as a scientific experiment. And ultimately, the shark is the 4th part, which is it's just bent on its survival, and it's going to do what's necessary to survive.
That's an extremely astute take. I hadn't really given it that level of perspective. So, especially when you tie in Quinn, and his experience on the Indianapolis is going to come up later on, but it's certainly something that the first time I watched it, I remembered something about it, but it didn't stick with me nearly as much as it did this time, where I actually really paid attention to that scene, because it moves very slowly in that early portion, but it's such a pivotal portion of what this movie is about, and so much of their character buildup. And I really hadn't considered tying that into why he smashes the radio, so that's a good point. All right, let's move to best performance. Who do you have down as your best performer?
Robert Shaw. I just think Robert Shaw, every time I've seen anything Robert Shaw is in, he just has a presence. Whether it's stuff that's completely unrelated, like A Man for All Seasons, or the James Bond film, or The Sting, he just has a presence. And he was an extremely good actor, very gifted. He was a Shakespearean actor in the Royal Shakespeare Company for a number of years. he did movies because they paid better. And so he was trying to build up finances, and really he was being hounded for back taxes and was near being convicted and sentenced to prison for tax evasion on numerous occasions. So he did films, but his real passion and love was plays. He also wrote and had a very highly acclaimed play that he wrote. So he just has a presence that just comes off incredibly strong whenever he's on screen.
I do find it interesting that, I don't know if you came across this in your research, but he was very close to not doing this film. They had offered the part to quite a few other people, some very notable ones. I'm sure anybody can kind of look that up on the internet. This is all
Lee Marvin and Sterling Hayden among them.
Yes. But they didn't have the roles of Quint or Hooper cast until about a week ahead of time of shooting. And part of the intuition of this was that he listened to his wife and secretary, that's who it was, about taking this movie, because they were the only other time they had been nearly as insistent in him doing the movie was when he played I'm drawing on memory, but when he was in the James Bond movie From Russia with Love, which we may or may not cover at some point during the course of this series. So he figured that he had listened to them before, and that obviously hit, that he would likely be able to hit on this movie as well. And part of the reason that he really didn't want to take the movie, and I think it was a problem for a lot of the actors in being a part of this movie, I know that Richard Dreyfuss originally said no as well, was they really didn't like the novel. I find it very fascinating that even though it was based on it, most of the people surrounding it really did not care for the novel, despite it being a bestseller. My best performer was Steven Spielberg. Steven Spielberg had made one other non-TV show TV movie up to this point, and this was the movie that really launched him. And given how much he basically got away with in order to make this movie, it's an absolute astonishment that this was ever made. By far, the cast and the crew, he has a tradition now on every movie that he does, apparently, where he is not present on set for the last scene of any movie that he shoots, because for this movie, he did not show up to the end. He thought that the crew would toss him into the ocean. And so it's now become this tradition that he does not show up to the final scene shooting of any of his movies as a result, because the crew had nicknamed this movie Flaws. And as a result, he was 100 days over schedule for shooting. He was well over budget. I mean, the amount of things that he had to get away with in order to make this movie, and the things that he insisted upon, I really don't think the movie would have worked as well had it been shot in a tank or not down on the ocean like he insisted on doing. But it took so much out of him to try and redo this, and some of that is inexperience, it's youth. Even he has credited that in later interviews that he has made, and sometimes all of those things have to come together in order for the happy accidents that are movie making. Similarly, he tried to use all these animatronic sharks that kept breaking down during the course of filming, which he credits with turning him from a cheap horror film director into being Hitchcockian. That he made the movie much more suspenseful, that you would only see a dorsal fin every so often, and so you imagined more in your mind, or that the score associated with the shark and the impending doom that may happen made everything much more horrifying and scary. And so he credits the almost accidental nature of this film with making it that much better. But these are all the things that are mistakes that just genuinely worked out. Not intentions, but are simply happy accidents, and they're all over this movie. So, that being said, you would think that I'm arguing against him being the best performer, but ultimately, if he's not there, if he's not one of the I would say he's minimally in the top 5 and probably top 3 of greatest directors of all time. I really don't know if this movie works. All of his choices, while ending up being problems, ended up creating all of these happy accidents that make this film exactly what it is. And for all the things that he put together, all the random casting choices that he made, all the story choices that he made. I mean, the fact that it was out at sea additionally added to the fact that they were finishing rewrites of the script day of, and so sometimes it didn't even allow for them to finish the rewrite had it not been that they had bad weather out at sea. So, I mean, all these things coming together just to make this movie. I find it exceptional that this was ever made, and it's an incredible compliment to him somehow that it was.
Well, one of the things that caused the delay in filming is that because Robert Shaw had such problems with the IRS here and with the Revenue Department or the Exchequer in Britain, if he stayed more than 5 days in the United States at one time, he could be deported. So they would have him there 5 days. They would put him on a chartered flight and fly him to Montreal, and he'd stay for a couple of days, then fly back.
Well, in addition, he had severe bouts of binge drinking that caused their own problems, to put it nicely.
Well, binge drinking tried constant drinking. They basically said that he would go through a fifth of whiskey in between takes as they filmed every day.
Let's move quickly to Best Secondary Performer. Honestly, if I could put it as co-best performance, I really would. I thought for a long time I was going to put him as the best performer, but for me it has to be John Williams. I don't think that the score overall was necessarily the best, because you start listening to individual parts of different things. There are some different choices that really changed the tone of the movie, and I think Spielberg wanted it that way. There are some sequences where there's some really soaring, like high seas, pirate-esque music that they like to do, like you would hear in Mutiny on the Bounty type of situation, that I think took me out of the film a little bit, although I understand the choice of why they made it, and it doesn't detract too much. But is there really, and we led the show off with it, but is there any more recognizable movie bar or sequence of notes than those two? The alternate between E and F, or if you will, F and F sharp.
No, I understand. And the interesting thing is when Spielberg first had him play the thing, or the score to him, he chuckled and said, "No, what do you really got?"
Yeah. Well, because he played it on a different instrument. They wondered, because of the higher register of the notes, why they didn't have something like a French horn play it. And Williams thought it was much more menacing. But you think of all of the things that we associate with John Williams over the years. Indiana Jones, Superman, Star Wars, and I'm sure that Jurassic Park. All of those scores, all of that brilliance, the things that we've associated with the movies that we most remember, are made because he decided to make these two notes. You wonder sometimes the brilliance of somebody being able to so exquisitely tie a subject and a feeling together, that somehow he recognized the impending suspense. I mean, we already talked about how accidental Spielberg's suspense parts of this film were, but that the way Williams describes it as being kind of a rhythmic heartbeat is accurate. That honestly, those two notes would be great if everybody or anybody did a very short story of the Telltale Heart. It would fit overlapping that so accurately. And yet, I don't care whether you go to a football game, if you're getting it in some other pop culture reference. Literally, you play those two notes. Anybody can tell you what this film is, what it's from, what it's about, what it means, and how it makes them feel, because it's the same. And I really don't know if there's another piece of music Other than maybe the first couple of bars of Star Wars when the screen crawl comes on for certain fanboys, that gives anybody that same logical tie-in. It's just the perfect marriage. I really don't know what else to describe it as.
That was my secondary performer. I had the same thing because the soundtrack really was huge in this film. I mean, you didn't need to know. You didn't need to even see the film. If you heard the music, you knew the shark's coming.
Well, I know there are film scores that you hear them and you associate them immediately with a certain movie. Psycho is one where you get the eerie knife stabbing sound, and I'm not going to try and make it because it'll sound terrible on the audio. But everybody knows exactly what I mean. But there aren't many of those pre-existing John Williams really doing that with Indiana Jones and Superman and some of the most classic film scores that we've ever heard, or certain theme music. Now, that seems to be tied in all over the place anymore. Like, you can play certain Batman themes or the Avengers or other different action movies with their scoring, and they're very tied to it. But I think Williams took it to another level when he started it with this movie.
I agree with you. I mean, this really launched his career.
And we're all the better for it. It's unfortunate to see him kind of retire at this point. Anyway, let's move into most charismatic. I had down Robert Shaw. I would agree with a lot of the points you made for best performer, but I put him more in this particular category because anytime he's on screen, he's the most engaging character. He seems like the guy that is the harshest, but you're most endeared to his character, and I think it really sells in that scene where he explains the Indianapolis. And you get all of that extra backstory. But you think about even how he's introduced with the nails on the chalkboard in the town hall meeting and all of his proclivities or his eccentricities that he imbues in this particular character as the old sea captain type of thing that he almost overplays it in parts where you think he could have come straight out of like a Scooby-Doo episode, but then he like reins it just back enough so that it's not overwrought. And I just think I think you lose certain aspects of Richard Dreyfuss and Roy Scheider in this movie, and they could have been probably generously played by a bunch of other people. I agree with Spielberg's concept and how he cast the movie, that he didn't want huge stars tied to the movie because they would overpower the narrative, and he wanted the shark to be the real star, which it really is. But for what it's worth, out of those particularly three characters, I think, and especially the second half of the movie, where I think this is a movie of two halves, really, and that's why it ends up being as good as it is, because some concepts die after a while, and the fact that they had these two halves of the whole, I really think he carried the second half of the movie.
Well, and I agree with you. I mean, he just had this knack. And I mean, you think about it. The original scene introducing him into the film was supposed to be him in a movie theater. They search him out. They find him in a movie theater watching Moby Dick. And the reason the scene was cut and they had to do a different scene to insert him was because Gregory Peck owned the film rights to Moby Dick from when he played Captain Ahab. And he refused to allow the studio to show a clip of it to be put into the theater. So they just cut it out and refilmed it.
So let's move. Well, let me guess. You also had Robert Shaw as your most charismatic?
Yes.
I figured as much. I just wanted to clarify. Best scene. Do you want to nominate one first, or do you allow me to go?
Go ahead.
So, in order to do this one, I think it only serves justice to read the entire monologue, and I will try my best. But my first nominee is the scene with the Indianapolis. You were on the Indianapolis? What happened? Japanese submarine slammed 2 torpedoes into our side, Chief. We was coming back from the island of Tinian to Leyte. Just delivered the bomb. The Hiroshima bomb. 1,100 men went into the water. Vessel went down in 12 minutes. Didn't see the first shark for about a half an hour. Tiger, 13-footer. You know how you know when you're in the water, Chief? You tell by looking from the dorsal to the tail fin. What we didn't know was our bomb mission had been so secret, no distress signal had been sent. They didn't even list us overdue for a week. Very first light, Chief. Sharks come cruising. So we formed ourselves into tight groups. You know, it was kind of like old squares in the battle, like you see in the calendar named the Battle of Waterloo, and the idea was, shark comes to the nearest man. That man, he starts pounding and hollering and screaming, and sometimes the shark will go away. But sometimes he wouldn't go away. Sometimes that shark, he looks right into you, right into your eyes. And you know, the thing about a shark, he's got lifeless eyes, black eyes, like a doll's eyes, when he comes at you. Doesn't seem to be living until he bites you. And those black eyes roll over white, and then you hear the terrible high-pitched screaming. The ocean turns red, and despite all the pounding and the hollering, they all come in and they rip you to pieces. You know, by the end of that first dawn, lost 100 men. I don't know how many sharks, maybe 1,000. I know how many men. They average 6 an hour. On Thursday morning, Chief, I bumped into a friend of mine, Herbie Robinson from Cleveland, baseball player, boatswain's mate. I thought he was asleep. I reached over to wake him up. He bobbed up, down in the water, just like a kind of top. Upended. Well, he'd been bitten in half from below the waist. Noon, the 5th day, Mr. Hooper. A Lockheed Ventura saw us. He swung in low and he saw us. He was a young pilot, a lot younger than Mr. Hooper. Anyway, he saw us and he come in low, and 3 hours later a big fat PBY comes down and starts to pick us up. You know, that was the time I was most frightened, waiting for my turn. I'll never put on a life jacket again. So, 1,100 men went into the water, 316 men come out, and the sharks took the rest. June the 29th, 1945. Anyway, we delivered the bomb.
Yeah.
How'd it do?
Decent. Very well. Good. When the first take was done, Shaw saw that he was supposed to be drunk. So, of course, Shaw got drunk.
Yeah, of course.
And thought he was going to do the part that way. It was just an absolute joke. And Spielberg was just like, oh, you know. And they wrapped. And about 2 a.m., Spielberg gets woke up by a call, and it's Shaw. And he's like, I'm really embarrassed. I really, I'm going to not drink tomorrow. And then I'm going to, we'll do it. I'll do it perfectly. So he came in, they shot it. It was one take. Not any editing, not any part. One take. First time. He nailed it.
For how the scene starts, and it just takes that emotional turn, and I think it was a very great use of how to do the scene, that they set it up where these guys are getting drunk and they're just kind of swapping stories, and it seems jovial and like there's nothing serious, and then you just hit that one spot and it just turns on an absolute dime that the scene changes, and you have this close-up and this seriousness and just explaining all of the things that go with it. And it adds this extra layer of the suspense of what they're trying to accomplish. And I just found it so mesmerizing. So, do you have a first nominee?
The hospital. The scene where the kid or the younger man had his leg bitten off in the pond area, and the mayor's like in shock. Brody's like, sign this voucher. That kind of was a turning point to me in the movie, because that was like the transition from getting to the point where we have to do something to now we're going to do something.
Do you have another nominee?
Yes. Brady kills the beast.
You mean Brody?
Or excuse me, Brody. I misspoke. Yes,
so
Brody kills the beast. Sequence? Yep.
Can I expand that a little bit? So I also had this as a nominee, but I'd like to extend, because I think from about the point where Dreyfuss enters the shark cage up and through the final explosion, more or less, and the film kind of tapers down after that a little bit, but I want to treat as like one long piece. So what for you stood out about that scene?
Well, you're on your edge. You want to see Brody get the shark. You're also, thinking at this point in time the chances of him succeeding are pretty low, and you want to believe, but you're also thinking, well, they may just pull something here and off him too, and the shark wins. So there was a certain amount of drama, suspense, so to speak, that was there, trying to get it set up. But you think back on it, they had done so many, little, hidden bones setting that scene up, about the tanks, they could explode, and all the different stuff, and what a shark would eat and wouldn't eat. And, if you go back through and that scene's there and then watch it again, you see all the four shadows throughout the film of what's going to ultimately happen.
Yeah, when they first talk about the tanks and Dreyfuss yells at him that they're compressed air, and I'm like, okay, yeah, you can see kind of where the film's going once you know how it ends, and so there's a little bit of foreshadowing that you get, I think is a good use of storytelling, that they don't really waste too much of that. But I think there are so many elements to that final sequence. So they're basically at the point of exasperation. I think at that point, is it 3 or is it 4 barrels? I think it's 3 that they basically have tied to the shark. And originally in the book, the shark succumbs to its injuries. But Spielberg wanted a much more thrilling conclusion that seemed to give it this finality. I know it's a bit underdone because they disproved that the compressed air tank would explode with the impact of a bullet on Mythbusters, but let's just treat it as its own movie moment, because it's still incredibly famous. But first off, and again, this is my research level and whatever else, I really tried to do a little bit more deep diving on this one. Apparently they had real shark sequences that were filmed in southern Australia. And during one of the sequences, they had somebody attack the shark cage. Or not somebody, but had a great white shark actually attack the shark cage. And so that scene where the shark is really like ripping apart the cage and kind of like pulling off the entire cage from the boat and all of that, that was written into the redeveloped part of the script, because originally Dreyfuss and Hooper are supposed to die. But because there was nobody in the cage at the time that they caught this footage, they needed Dreyfuss to get out of the cage and escape, and so it actually saves his character. But from the veracity of the shark tearing apart that cage, and that was actually real footage, so that's not even something staged or animatronic, to then the shark getting up on the boat and ending up swallowing Quint basically whole, which he foreshadows at one point, the shark, he'll swallow you whole. And that's its own thing, and it ultimately comes back around to end up being his demise. But then you get into the final sequence, and how many, I think it's like 4 or 5 shots that Brody has to shoot, and you're like, he's not going to hit this thing. Why is it? And all of a sudden he then delivers that line, "Smile, you son of a bitch." And, that becomes its climactic finish. The shark is no more. And somehow firing a rifle from the crow's nest of a sinking boat is our final sequence. But it works so well, and it's extremely satisfying and thrilling, and it just works.
Do you have another scene?
I'm going to go with the 4th of July. So I think this is really I understand where you went with the hospital scene, and there's a little bit to that going on. But I think the dividing line really is that 4th of July sequence. Everybody's on the beach. The mayor's trying to tell people to get into the water. And I think this is one of the more brilliant master-making scenes in the movie for me. For as much as Spielberg did, because I really watched it with my own movie maker type eye. The diversion he creates throughout this scene, because you're really set up to think the shark has attacked everybody at the beach so far to this point in the movie. He's done it in kind of open water, and there's really nothing going to go on, and you never get that personal sense where it's attached to one of the characters. And all of a sudden, Brody sends out his son and his friends into the pond, and they create this diversion that you really don't see coming unless you've seen the film before, until it happens. And the shark goes into the pond, and it doesn't end up killing his son, but he does get the one guy and tears off his leg, which you then see float to the bottom of the pond. But for all of the diversionary tactics and the suspense that goes into that entire moment, because even up to that point, you get a fake shark sighting with one of the kids playing a prank, and that's like, oh, we finally seen the shark, and everybody's going to be safe, and we're all good. And then to completely 180 that, and all of a sudden the shark is coming after the kids. It's just such a brilliant stroke of plotting, of setting, and of movie making that I just have to applaud the whole sequence. Do you have any others?
We need a bigger boat.
Yeah, I think that, so I have that as chasing the shark, although that could be a much longer sequence, but for all of the things that happen during that sequence, I think that is the most notable, probably scariest moment, is you don't see it coming until it does, and the shark just kind of pops out of the water, and he's like right there at you, because you really haven't seen his face up to that point, and that's what's the horrifying notion, that all of a sudden it's just like right there in your face, and you weren't expecting it.
Yeah.
The only other one that I had down was, I'm going to call it, you've already kind of alluded to it, but you knew and my son is dead. And I think I have the quote down here. Yes. So Mrs. Kintner, who is actually somebody who was from Martha's Vineyard. It wasn't a real actress. She was just a random bystander that they were using as an extra, and she somehow got cast into the film. So Mrs. Kintner, Chief Brody, yes. Mrs. Kintner slaps him, starts crying. I just found out that a girl got killed here last week, and you knew it. You knew there was a shark out there. You knew it was dangerous, but you let people go swimming anyway. You knew all those things. But still, my boy is dead now, and there's nothing you could do about it. My boy is dead. I wanted you to know that. Leaves with her father. I'm sorry, Martin, she's wrong. Chief Martin Brody, no, she's not. I think for what the first half of the movie is, and not taking the precautions, I think there are two main protagonists, or not protagonists, but antagonists to this film. You would clearly say the shark is one of them. But up until the second half of the movie, he's not the primary antagonist. Ultimately, you would say that the mayor is, and every time you watch this movie, you just seem to, at least I do, I seem to get angrier and angrier that he's not taking the advice.
Yeah, no, I understand. Interesting story with that woman, and I can't remember, what was the son's name?
The character, or?
Yes, the character.
I don't remember.
I whatever his name was. So the woman had moved away. She had lived someplace other than there. She came to visit, and she went into a restaurant, and they had on the menu if his name was Scott Kittner, the Scott Kittner sandwich. And she's like, what? And so she's like, tells the waitress, what's this? I played the mother in the movie. And so she goes back, and all of a sudden this guy comes running out. He owns the restaurant. It was the kid from the movie that played her son in it. And he was the restaurant owner. And they had not seen each other since the filming.
Interesting. That is a great anecdote. All right, so out of all of those that we've nominated so far, what for you was the best scene?
The Indianapolis.
It was mine too. I just think there's so much rawness and vulnerability that it slows down the movie enough to engage you on an emotional and psychological level that really there is no other spot in this movie that it does so. And I think it's just a wonderful pause. It's kind of like in most songs you get that bridge where the music kind of changes for a little bit. You get out of the regular melody and the refrain, and you kind of have that small piece. That's what this seems to be in the course of this movie.
I'll agree with that. I mean, it's to me the most indelible moment of the movie.
Okay, I had the final sequence as most indelible just because I think it's the most iconic. Other than the line, which I'll get around to for when we get to best lines here in a second. I think the explosion and what happens at the ending, because it's so thrilling, ends up being iconic. But I certainly understand why you would say that is the most indelible. What did you have as your favorite scene?
The same. I mean, to me, it's just... That scene says so much. Sweep. Yeah. I'm a military historian, so I've known about the Indianapolis and other situations for a long time. And there's an entire book that was written about the story of the Indianapolis. And it's just, it's chilling. And to hear the story and, in a first person account, it explains how an event like that can shape a person.
I mean, it's absolutely haunting, and especially with the way he did it. So to a certain extent, I realize that maybe my accent might have been bad, but I hope the audience can kind of look past that in my attempt at trying to, for what it's worth, imitate Robert Shaw. And how much we appreciate that scene. For me, it's the 4th of July. As far as favorite scene, I love what they did with that scene. I think there are several of them that I could pick out and that are endlessly rewatchable in this movie because I really don't find it horrifying, but I just think the way that the suspense works and how much they set up and kind of flip the script on you. And you, especially once you've seen the movie before and you know what's going to happen and you can see all the mechanics and the gears behind it and how they're setting things up, I think it really works for me. So that looks like a good spot for us to briefly cut to one of our sponsors. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Let's jump right back into best lines. So I already read the sequence from the USS Indianapolis story. I already also read the scene sequence from Mrs. Kittner, and I would like to nominate those two. I don't think I need to revisit both of those explicitly, just because of how much I went into those. But do you have any other nominees that you'd like to put up?
Farewell and adieu to you, my fair Spanish ladies.
I thought about doing that one, but I thought I'd have to rewatch the musical tune in order to make sure it's there. And I really thought that it was a good use of character to have him constantly be singing these like shanty tunes. So that's a good nominee. I won't steal one of the biggest ones, but Smile, You Son of a Bitch is got to be up near the top on this particular movie because of where it happens in the movie and how fitting it is to that final, I guess, moment. Yes. So I'll nominate that one.
Well, this is not a boat accident, and it wasn't a propeller, and it wasn't any coral reef, and it wasn't Jack the Ripper. It was a shark.
Yeah, another one from Hooper. I had a different one before we get to the final big one, but what am I going to tell the kids? Tell them I'm going fishing.
Here lies the body of Mary Lee, died at the age of 103. She was 15 years she kept her virginity, and a bad record for that. Not a bad record for this vicinity.
There are some great moments of comedy and levity for this being kind of horror-esque thriller. So I do want to highlight that, and I think that's another one to definitely include. Do you want to nominate the final one?
Yeah. We need a bigger boat.
We're going
to need a bigger boat.
No, you're going to need a bigger boat. And
we're going to need a bigger boat. And then he goes over to Quint and says, you're going to need a bigger boat.
Okay, yeah, you're right. So the reason of when that takes place in the movie, and for all the things that we already said about when that was going to come up, I do find it interesting. So first off, because the script didn't have a lot of the dialogue finished and they had some different things going on, that was one of the more famous ad-libs in American film history. I don't know how many people know that one. It's not even on the Wikipedia page, so there's just an extra little tidbit for everybody. But in addition to it being an ad-lib, it was clear that they wanted that to be a big line because in the editing process during the screening, they thought because either there were gasps or other audible issues with what was going on, they had to actually separate the line itself a little bit from the rest of the sequence to give them a certain level of pause so that the line could stand on its own. And they amplified the sound of the line to make sure that people heard it because they knew the importance of that line. So I do find it interesting that even during the course of producing this film, they realized how important that was to the overall of the movie. So out of these, what is your best line?
We're going to need a bigger boat.
Yeah, I really don't.
I mean, how many times have you used that line? I've used it like 100 times. We're going to need a bigger boat. We're going to need a bigger,
We're not smarter than everybody else that has been able to produce all of these things. I think there are plenty of honorable mentions, and I think personally I'm going to put that whole sequence about the Indianapolis as my honorable mention because I think it needs to be mentioned just for how classic and how good that particular moment is. And there are some moments of levity that we'll clearly have as the funniest line. I'll let you even pick which other ones. But, I mean, this has been recognized as the best line, the most quintessential, indelible line of the entire movie for 40-some years at this point. So let's not reinvent the wheel. So what do you have as the funniest line, then?
I like the here lies the body of Mary Lee.
Shocking that you'd pick that one. I guess let's hope Mom doesn't listen to this episode again. All right. You want to move into our Stanley rubric. What did you have down for Legacy?
I had this at a 9.5. It's iconic. It has a long... I mean, you can talk about Jaws now. It's a 40-year-old film. It's still, you still have people. You go to a pool party and you'll have people da-dun, da-dun, da-dun. I mean, it's existed. It has transcended generations. There are kids who know about Jaws who have never seen the film, but they know the iconic parts of it.
So I'm going to make this as a multi-front argument, okay? And I won't give my score on the front end. I'm going to lead this all up to the back end. Number one, this was the box office record holder and completely changed the way that cinema was produced because they wanted all of the proceeds on the front end. So when they talk in modern terms of movie making and the business of movies and all of this as to how it did on its opening weekend and all the records they want to send because they want the money up front, it's because they wanted production proceeds like Jaws. When this is the first movie that was released in like a wide swath. Up until this point, they would do it market by market and let things build. And this was the first one where they just dropped it on the whole country at one time. This is another one that was one of the first big movies internationally. It was one of the first, or it's the movie that originally created the summer blockbuster. And for 30 to almost 40 years, we've been talking about summer movie season. Because up until that point, summer had just been when movies would be dumped by studios when people weren't paying attention because they were outside and they were doing other things. You want to talk about the fact that the musical score, we've said it I don't know how many times during the course of this program, that the two notes alone are so readily associated with this movie, and people know exactly what it's about, the concept of the movie, and how things are tied together, that it lives in the pop cultural lexicon like almost nothing else does, from a musical score and a movie being so intertwined. And if you want to talk about action-adventure movies and high concept and basically the creation of what is both one of the greatest composers in film history as well as one of the great directors in film history, I don't know how in the world this isn't a 10.
All right. I'll concede. I will agree it's a 10. I try to avoid giving 10s unless I absolutely think, and now you've made a good point and you've convinced me. I'll agree it's a 10.
I just think this has so many, because I agree with you. 10s are very hard for me, and I've been a little bit more willing than you have. But when I see a 10, I don't want to shy away from what it truly is a 10. I want to be able to set, this for me is an absolute 10, and this sets the market on what needs to be a 10 for this category. Impact significance. I will make almost the exact same argument. How much it changed film history in this period where we go from blockbusters. I gave it another 10. I'm sorry. They're just, in the short term, there is nothing like it, from a production, from all of the things that went into it, and all of the things that it changed about how people made movies and the business of movies. I think it has to be a 10. It's just simply there. The only knock I can maybe give on it is they really didn't recognize it at the time, given the fact that, yes, it was up for Best Picture, but Steven Spielberg is still hot over the fact that he wasn't even nominated for Best Director that year.
It was his first film.
I understand, but like, Damien Chazelle was nominated for Whiplash, I think. No, maybe he wasn't. But he was nominated for his second film. I mean,
the only reason that they brought in Spielberg to do this is because the producers happened to see the TV film made for TV that a friend of ours refers to on a continuous basis, Duel, with Dennis Weaver. That was the first full-length film that Spielberg had done, And the reason is they'd watched it and they thought, if you were to change a driverless truck trying to kill somebody to shark, maybe this guy could do the job. And so that's how they decided to hire him. The first guy they brought in came in and he started talking about what he was going to do as far as opening scenes. And then he says, and then the boat comes, and then the whale comes up, and they go, whale? What are you talking about, a whale? If you can't understand the difference between a shark and a whale, you're an idiot. Get out of here. And they ended the meeting right there and then brought him in.
Well, two of the other factors that I want to lead into this. This movie led to something being known as, I think it was cinema paresis, that there is an associated condition of mental disorder that you can have from a film because a woman who was like 17 or 18 at the time actually had such severe, I guess, night terrors or nightmares of a sort that she cannot or could not for multiple weeks on end, could not wake up without screaming sharks. And there are so many other feel lines through this. I mean, this was horrifying. It was thrilling. It was a huge box office draw. I really don't think that one of the biggest other legacy movies of the decade, Star Wars, would have been able to have been made had it not been for this movie and how it was produced, because Star Wars came out in May of '77. Another one that you could put in the line of summer blockbuster types. And there are so many other pieces that this opened up a huge door toward that I really don't know if we can quantify how quickly and how impactful it was in its essence.
Well, it launched John Williams.
I think that has a little bit more to do with legacy, but given the amount of things that he did within the 5-year period after this, I would have to grant you that as well. So, all right. What did you have down, though, for impact significance?
This film was all the rage. Everybody talked about it. I mean, the number of swimmers on the beaches in New Jersey and in New England and in Florida all dropped precipitously right after this film came out. So it had a huge impact. The only thing I could say is, and I having lived through this, but I was a kid, so it's a little harder for me to say what the overall impact was. I would have to say it's pretty close to a 10. I'd go 9.5, only because I don't think everybody saw the film. There was I can honestly say, for example, your grandparents, who would have been, in their late 30s at the time, did not see this film, or early 30s.
You have to understand that I think there's a layer of people when they're in their early years of having kids, before their kids are like 10 and older, that probably have a complete gap in movies because they just don't see everything. And I think there's a significant portion of the population that has like a 10-year movie gap, any of the parents out there. So I don't blame them for that. I almost gloss over that. One thing I did forget to mention, and I'm glad you brought up the dwindling beaches, but another point in the legacy column, one of the biggest cultural impact moments that we've had for an entire cable channel for years has been fucking Shark Week, which only happens because of this movie.
Which our current president was in.
That's Sharknado.
Sharknado. Yes.
So
yes.
To your point, yet again, our fascination with sharks almost all comes out of this movie. Anyway, let's move on to novelty. I had a 9.5. I refrain from giving straight 10s on this, but there are so many pieces to this that are just original that I have a hard time not giving it at least a 9.5. I really had a devolving nature, but there are things that they borrow from that aren't necessarily original. They used a large animatronic, which was not necessarily original. They did film at sea. That was original and very concept. This is the first film that tried to film out at sea. So that is, I guess, a novel piece of the movie making process and how they did this movie. I won't say that trying to imitate and kind of do some adventure sequencing in the score and some of the rest of it to make it seem like kind of a piratey movie was necessarily novel, but for the public's infatuation with sharks and all of the other layers of this when they released the movie, how much of an impact it made, I kind of can't ignore that when grading out to novelty, so I gave it a 9.5. What say you?
I had a 9 because even though there were so many, novel elements, this is basically whether you call it or not, it's a slasher movie. I mean, there's a villain. I don't think that the shark is just along the line of so many of the different horror movies that were available, whether it be Frankenstein, The Mummy, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. They are all, there's a certain element. They took that element and just put it in the sea and made the shark. So to that, I have to give it a point less. So I give it a 9.
I'm going to come down to your 9, and we'll just agree on that one. I don't have too many disagreements with your point there, and I just don't know if I can completely go up to the 10 because of how we've set the 10 before as to what you have to be for a novelty of a concept. All right, classicness. I had an 8.5. I don't think that this movie is particularly aged poorly. Again, I think this could be relatively released now and still be okay. But there are a couple of things that kind of work against it. One, I really don't know if you could make the movie in the way that they did and still get it released. We've already mentioned that on the show. The amount of things that they had to basically give leeway for this to even come about is not something that's there. But also, there are almost no women in this movie. When they are, they're kind of substitutes or fill in to move the sequence along, not like they're important characters. There's no diversity at all.
How do you know the shark wasn't a woman?
That's fair. I just there are some points here to knock it down, so I went with an 8.5. I can't give it too much more than that based on what we've had. I will say that some of the horror elements, given how culture, and there are some things with the special effects, because you do see when the shark comes out of the water and is on the boat, there are certain shots where you're like, oh my god, that is just so cheesy, the animatronic, that like you could tell, and yes. it's bad, but there are just some little hit points that reduce it down that far to me, and I still think an 8.5 is extremely high. So
yeah, I had an 8 for that very reason. There were several scenes with the shark that you could go, oh my god, looks so bad. It's so rubbery. And it's been, or the version we watched was digitalized and restored. Yeah. So the remastery was so much clearer than it was when the footage was originally in theaters. So you can see everything. So to that extent, yes, that's exactly why I went with an 8 on this, for that very reason, that it just, the special effects. Anytime you're going to do special effects at that time compared to what we have now, it just pales.
Oh, certainly. And I think you see that in a lot of the earlier Spielberg movies, that he just was playing in unusual territory that nobody had really done before to that point, particularly with this type of movie, that you can't, unfortunately, you grade it down for the essence of the movie, but you understand and can kind of give it its due a little bit if you maybe give it context and circumstance. I mean, the other things, as far as classicness and the emotional resonance, and it's going to affect my rewatchability score than my classicness score, But there is an element to this movie where once you've seen it the one time or you know the ending, it kind of takes a little bit of the air out of the balloon of the thrill of the movie. You do know, especially if you do know the ending, you still don't know some of the sequencing, and you do have to have a little bit of distance in order for the film to work. I don't think you can watch this multiple times and still get the same thrill out of it that you would if you watch it maybe once a year, every 6 months, something like that. So, but that grades it or averages out to 8.25 between the two of us. So I'll just, since I mentioned it already, my rewatchability score was a 6.5. This is, again, I think our scale is probably the hardest on rewatchability more than anything else, given what types of movies we end up rewatching a lot, or the ones that we go to as our comfort movies. So this is not a comfort movie for me. I wouldn't say that this is like a high concept that I really need to think. When we graded out Bridge on the River Kwai a couple of weeks ago, you said this, or that was a movie that you needed to think. I don't think there's a lot of thought that needs to go into experiencing this movie. Most of it's kind of an adventure quality. And so I guess I graded a little bit higher because you don't need to think about it as much. But there are so many other pieces that go into this that it's not one that's always going to make me laugh, although it does have some nice comedic moments. It's not one that I'm gravitating towards putting on a random Friday night because I love the movie or something. And it's not one that has been one of my classics or go-to, although I'd be more open to having it because I do enjoy the film. So I guess a good median point was somewhere between a 7 and a 6.5, and I felt comfortable going with a 6.5.
Well, I'm going to go not quite even as high as you. I'm going 5.5. I always start with a 5 and then go up or down based on that. And so much of this film is wrapped up in the suspense of what's going to happen and how it's going to happen that, once you know the ending, it's kind of like, okay. You can watch it and enjoy it for what it is, which is some of the acting, some of the screen shots, the directing, some of the dialogue. But otherwise, it's the ending. So okay. So I consider a film that something that I would watch again once in a while to be at that 5 mark, and then I go up based upon how often I would watch it. And I think I've watched this film about 5 times over the course of 40 years. That puts it at about every 8 years. That's about right. So I don't consider that much more than a 5. But I would give it a little more, so 5.5.
All right. So just to recap all of that, that was a 10 for legacy, a 9.75 for impact significance, 9 for novelty, 8.25 for classicness, a 6 for rewatchability. I found this actually to be interesting for as celebrated and popular as this movie was. It only has a 90% audience score, so that only gives it a 9. So ultimately it graded out to a straight 52 and ties with Silence of the Lambs for number 6. Currently. Okay.
I'm always amazed that no matter, when we're going through this and I start giving out high numbers and then low numbers at times, am I going to end up with this film being graded at a place where I'm not sure it should be? And then when we come up with a number and you say where it's near, I always go, that's about right.
Well, that's why we have multiples of us. I mean, it's not just one of our grades, but and you've factored over this. We've been kind of talking about this, and we're going to do a recap episode when we hit number 50 or get done with number 50 and just looking back on our season 1. But for a list that includes 39 movies, we have 2 ties already. I think it might be worth trying to revisit to break the ties at some point, but it's actually our last 2 movies have both been ties. So I find it interesting kind of where we're coming out, and we may need to figure out how to figure grade separation to get some let's say, more clarity on the list itself. But I think that'll be something to play with possibly for season 2. I'm certainly not opposed to revisiting any of the ones that we currently have tied on the list, or maybe getting a new perspective added in.
Sure. That might be a good one to find somebody who is a fan or somebody who's listening who would be interested in being a guest.
Sounds like a plan. Do you have any remaining questions?
I remember seeing Jaws 2 barely. I've seen it once. So I assume that many of the questions that were left unresolved ultimately were resolved. But one of them I would like to know. The shark gets blown up. Considering that so much of different parts were still in the shark days later that they had cut open, that they had captured on the dock, that Hooper opened, how much of Quint was still in the shark?
That's an interesting thought. I would guess a significant amount. He may have been oatmeal-like, but probably quite a bit. My first one was an intended, apparently, open question of the movie. So when they rewrote the script from, or in its many different versions, because I think this passed through, like, by my count, somewhere between like 6 and 9 people that touched a version of the script, including the original author of the book wrote like 3 different versions around some type of writer's strike when they originally bought the rights to the book. But apparently the last guy to come in...
cameo, by the way.
Yeah, I know. One of the last guys to touch it, I think he was the primary writer who ended up doing the on-set writing at the end, wrote in that in order to kind of soften or remake Brody's character, that he was intentionally afraid of the water. I guess, but the problem is they never really explain why. And for me, that's one of the biggest open-ended questions of the movie. They kind of half resolve it in the last moment of the movie. You know, I was always so afraid of the water. I wonder why. And you get that last moment to kind of like give a certain level of levity at the end, but it's never really answered exactly why he's afraid of the water, unless I missed something.
It never is explained. I mean, and that happens. I know for a long time I was afraid of the water, but I know why I was afraid of the water. It came out much later on in my life as to an explanation. My mother was afraid of the water, and she was afraid of the water because when she was an infant, the buckboard that they were riding took off, with my mom still in the buckboard, and ran through the farm and ended up down by the creek and almost went into the creek. The horses stopped at the bank. And my grandmother was all afraid that my mother was going to drown in the creek. And so for the moment or every moment I've ever known, or I knew my grandmother, she was absolutely terrified of the water. And I mean, you couldn't even go near the water without her just like having a panic attack. And that's why. So it passes generationally. So who knows?
And I think for most people that are afraid of the water, there is some type of like personal dread or connection to why they do so. So I find it a little odd that although I understand why they made the choice and ultimately why it's left as an open-ended question, but it is something that maybe I would prefer to have had a more definitive answer on. So just me. I had one other question, but I'm going to skip it. So do you have anything else you'd like to address?
No. I just want to encourage everybody to go out and vote.
And on that note, there are not many opportunities to more or less overthrow your government peacefully that have ever existed in the structure of mankind. This is your opportunity to do so. For all of those people that constantly complain about everybody that's in elected office or how bad politicians are or how much they hate politics, I know that you have this cynical view, but decisions will be made with or without you. You should be having your input heard if you really want to continue to complain. If you're not exercising your vote, I no longer want to hear your complaints. I wish we could talk longer, but I'm expecting a friend for dinner. Next week, I guess we will be discussing All the President's Men, currently available on HBO Max. Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman. So that, I guess, will tie in with the...
Jason Robards.
Correct. That will tie in with the election feed, so stick around on this feed for that one. Please email the show if you'd like to get a hold of us. We did have a fan or a listener response this week, which we really appreciate. Somebody who was advocating for a very little-known film. So if that particular listener is out there, we did get it, and we do appreciate your feedback. The Greatest Movie of All Time is a production of Ronnie Duncan Studios. Our show is mixed, edited, and written by Thomas Duncan. Our music is thanks to Purple Planet Music. Our technical provider and distributor is Anchor FM.